Okay, so last time we talked about observation and experience, particularly as they relate to understandings of the body, both what bodies look like and where they come from. And we saw that by the middle of the 16th century, a new generation of anatomists were really trying to see in a new way. But we also saw that seeing is inflected by what people thought they should be seeing. Now let's take these insights about observation to the matter of disease and illness, and especially the matter of epidemic disease. Epidemics pose different problems of observation and explanation than anatomy, since they involve many people, oftentimes many different communities and many different cultures. They're dynamic, and they tax the explanatory powers of those who observe them. Nevertheless, how we explain epidemics, just like how we explain bodies, depends on different techniques of observation and interpretation. And to see how a variety of different people interpreted and responded to a variety of different epidemics, we'll look at three of them. Those three epidemics are plague, syphilis, and smallpox. Let's start with plague, the disease caused by the bacteria known as Yersinia pestis. As we mentioned during Week 1, we have good evidence that the first time plague struck Europe was in 1541, in an epidemic that came to be called the Plague of Justinian. This was a devastating plague, but it seems to have been largely forgotten by the Middle Ages. That's when, in the 1340s, something that seemed to be a new disease entity entered Europe. This is the so-called Black Death. This was also a disease driven by the pathogen Yersinia pestis, but it was unlike anything that had been seen before, or at least anything that had been seen in the memory of those observing it. Europeans were used to outbreaks of epidemic disease: smallpox, measles, dysentery, leprosy, typhus, spotted fever. The world was hardly free from epidemics. But these plagues tended to hit the hardest among specific populations: children, the elderly, the poor. Black Death, on the other hand, seemed indiscriminate. Everybody was vulnerable. The very young, the very old, the very weak, the very strong, the rich, the poor, men, women. Nobody was safe. Death united one and all. And that became the theme of many paintings like this one. This is The Triumph of Death by Peter Bruegel. And at first glance, what we see appears to be a painting of a war scene. There's burning landscapes, there's sunken ships, there's an army on the march. But when we look closer, we see that the marauding army is death itself, in the form of animate skeletons. And they're sweeping down on the population of this land, killing everything in front of them suddenly and indiscriminately. Here in this corner, a king reaches for his gold, while one skeleton helps itself and another mocks him with an hourglass. Here, death torments the participants of a merry dinner party. In this corner of the painting, death literally sounds the death knell. The end of the world is at hand. And here, a young couple plays music. They too will die in this plague, but at least they'll be together. This first outbreak of Black Death wouldn't be the last. For the next 400 years, plague would periodically sweep through Europe, leaving death in its wake and forcing its survivors to explain the mass suffering they'd witnessed. This theme of death running rampant was a common one in times of plague. Here we see a similar scene, this time from Sicily, circa 1445, in which plague, in the form of a skeleton riding a decaying horse, marauds through society, and we'll see here the arrows that are a staple in depictions of disease in this period. Here, for instance, we see arrows as a sign of disease striking the wealthy. Here, the poor cower as death takes some and leaves others maimed. Here, oblivious wealthy people play music and enjoy themselves as death bears down on them. This idea of the universality of plague eventually gives way to a sort of genre painting called the dance macabre. As with the triumph of death theme, the idea of the dance macabre predates the 1340s, but it took on great prominence in times of plague. And so what we're going to see here is a long dance macabre painting from Lübeck. The idea of this painting is that it shows death dancing with all strata of society, from the most powerful to the least. So in this section, for instance, we see death dancing with, in order from left to right, the Pope, the Emperor, and the Empress. Here, death dances with a cardinal, a king, and a bishop. Here, death dances with an abbot, a knight, a monk, and a mayor. Here we see a canon, this is a kind of lesser clergy, a nobleman, a physician, and you can tell he's a physician here because, of course, he's holding a uroscopy flask. Further on down the list, death dances with a banker, a curate, a merchant, and a parish clerk. Here with a craftsman, a hermit, and a peasant. And finally, at the very end, Death is dancing with a youth, a maiden, and a baby. And we note that there's a poem. There's poems that are attached to each of these figures. And in the traditional poem that goes along with this dance macabre, the baby asks, "How am I supposed to dance? I can't even walk." But Death does not care. Death will dance with the baby anyway. Okay, so one thing that we see here is that the reach of plague is universal. Everyone could be touched by plague. In addition to its ubiquity, we also know that the experience of the disease was terrifying. It would begin suddenly when seemingly healthy people would be gripped by fevers, chills, pain, and nausea. Close inspection would reveal the presence of painful boils on the necks, armpits, or groins of plague sufferers. These were called buboes, and they're the defining feature that gave bubonic plague its name. And here, if we zoom in, we can see that the patient is pointing to the bump that is the bubo under his armpit. St. Roch, patron saint of plagues, by the bubo on his thigh, as you can see here. As the disease set in with alarming rapidity, some victims would begin bleeding continuously from all of their orifices. Others would vomit blood. Some would be covered with spots or bruises from subcutaneous bleeding. The extremities of some victims would turn black and decay. Incoherence, ranting, and seizures often accompanied plague. For many plague sufferers, the end came quickly. Indeed, this was yet another terrifying feature of the disease. It could strike people down as though by lightning. Here in this scene from the 15th century, a man drops dead during a plague outbreak, even as he carries a victim to the grave. Daniel Defoe, in his book Journal of a Plague Year, which documented the London plague of 1665, writes of one man who checked into a local inn and asked the maid for a glass of ale. She got distracted and forgot to get his ale for a moment, and by the time she got back to her customer, he was dead from the plague. Moreover, as terrible as plague was for individuals, accounts from the period emphasize not just the pain of individuals, but the social devastation that plague visited upon whole communities. We read accounts of cities ground to a halt, bodies piled in the streets, too few living people to bury the dead. And you can see this is a particularly horrible tableau is by Gaetano Zumbo from the late 1600s. It's a work in wax depicting a recent plague outbreak. Those who remained lived in fear of one another. Doctors were afraid to treat patients. Clergy were afraid to minister to their congregations. Parents rejected their children. Children rejected their parents. Here in this painting, we see a common trope that is a child attempting to nurse from a dead mother. Finally, accounts from the first plague outbreak in the 1340s emphasize that plague is unlike anything that had been seen before. Previously, epidemics fit under the subheading of war, famine, earthquakes. These were disasters, to be sure, but they weren't extraordinary events. Plague was different. Matteo Villani, as a Florentine banker, wrote of the plague, and I quote, "It is set down in Holy Writ that, sin having corrupted all the ways of man's flesh, God sent the flood over the earth. Since then, as in time people have multiplied, there have been several individual floods, plagues, infections, and pestilences, famines, and many other ills that God has permitted to afflict men for their sins. But from what one can gather from written records, there has been from the great flood until now no universal judgment of plague so all-embracing as what came in our day." So there's nothing like previous outbreaks of disease. It seemed like nothing since the Great Flood. Petrarch, a poet and naturalist who lived through the Black Death, wrote, "Will posterity credit that there was a time when, with no deluge from heaven, no worldwide conflagration, no wars or other visible devastation, not merely this or that territory, but almost the whole world was depopulated? When was such a disaster ever seen, ever heard of? In what record can we read that houses were emptied, cities abandoned, countrysides untilled, fields heaped with corpses, and a vast, dreadful solitude all over the world?" And so, listen to the choice of words he uses. He says, "Will posterity credit that this happens?" Petrarch is not sure that people will believe him. Plague just makes no sense. Similarly, John Klyn, an Irish monk, wrote this as he sat among the dead, waiting for death to claim him. "And lest the writing should perish with the writer, and the work fail with the laborer, I leave parchment to continue this work. If, perchance, any man survives, and any of the race of Adam escape this pestilence, and carry on the work which I have begun." And the parchment stops abruptly thereafter. John Klyn did not live, he died of the plague, and he died unsure as to whether any other human being would survive the plague. But the race of Adam did survive, long enough to have to explain. How did people explain the causes of plague? Well, there were four main lines of thinking. There were explanations drawn from scholastic medicine. There were folk or alternative explanations. There were explanations that we might call conspiratorial explanations, and there were theological explanations. In general, most learned people thought that some sort of astrological event preceded the coming of plague. This would often be a comet or a shooting star. It might be an alignment of Saturn and Mars with Jupiter. Remember how horrible Saturn is. But whatever it would poison the air. The mass of air would move around across the globe, causing different cities to become sick, or it might become trapped in the airspaces in ships and transported from city to city that way. It might also permeate people's clothes, and that's how it was transmitted from city to city. Or it might beget more poisoned air, and that's what would cause the plague. And so in this cosmology, buboes could be seen as an exit point for putrefied matter. Also, the stench of cities in the summer, that might be a sign of plague too. This atmospheric idea is retained in some of our current vocabulary for disease. For instance, pestilence comes from pestilencia, a time of storms caused by the light from the stars. We might also think about epidemia, from epi, upon, and demos, containing air. So this is plague in the air. Finally, we might think of influenza, that is the influence of the stars on air. Perhaps ironically, folk explanations of the period might strike us as more in line with our own scientific understanding of disease. This is the time when we get our first glimpse of contagionism, that is the idea that disease could be transmitted from person to person. Girolamo Fracastorius, for instance, wrote that he felt that what he called seeds or tinder or fomites might be the conveyances of plague. And these fomites might spread through, as he said, quote, clothes, wooden objects, and things of that sort, which, though not themselves corrupted, can, nevertheless, preserve the original germs of the contagion and infect by means of these. And he meant this at a distance carried by air. And by germs here, it should be said that he means particles rather than tiny living creatures. But the idea is very similar. And I should emphasize that this was not the explanation of most learned practitioners. Fracastorius was in the minority. This was mainly considered a folk belief, or a belief that was held by people without scholarly learning. As for more conspiratorial explanations, there was one idea that perhaps the plague was a poison made by a person or people and passed along by sort of secret agents or a fifth column in society. This too was not the explanation of learned practitioners, but was common knowledge. So these poisoners would typically be enemies of the state or undesirable members of society. So the very poor, beggars, Jewish people in some places. This scene shows a trio of Spanish spies who are blamed for causing a plague outbreak in Milan. Finally, a common explanation held that plagues were the result of God's wrath. This explanation was not incompatible with other explanations. Perhaps God was angry because townspeople harbored undesirable people or spies. Perhaps God had sent bad airs, and so on and so forth. Here in the clouds, we can see Saint Sebastian pleading the case of the plague-stricken city with Christ. Whatever the explanation, plague demanded some sort of response. In the face of plague, people had to do something. The first thing that people could do, of course, was to run. We read about the option of flight in the Decameron, in which a group of wealthy Florentines go to shelter in place in a mountain villa, and they tell each other stories to pass the time. Fleeing is straightforward, but it's not as easy as it sounds. First of all, getting out of town was expensive. It was an option mainly for the very wealthy, like the people that you read about. Even skilled craftspeople, those who would otherwise be considered to have means, couldn't get very far. And besides, leaving town meant leaving businesses, and it so entailed a significant financial risk. Secondly, as we see in this slide, there was a distinct possibility that even if one was able to leave town, there would be nowhere to go. And here we see one potential problem. Plague-free communities were often loath to accept outsiders from plague-stricken lands. Again, this is on the theory that plague might be passed from person to person and not simply through bad airs. Here we also see another problem, namely, Plague might simply follow wherever one went. This simply added to the confusion, since there were cases of plague spreading without any apparent contact with prior plague victims. So, flight was one option and seemingly the best option, but it was not always a viable one. Second, one might look to humoral medicine to cure the plague. If plague was indeed caused when humors became corrupted with bad air, then the best thing to do might be to let the humors out. And this could be done in two ways. First, one could simply lance the bubo in order to release the corrupt humors, as shown here. The idea was that the bubonic swelling was simply humors trying to escape, so helping the body to expel them was simply helping nature to do its work. You could also take blood from other parts of the body. This was a practice called venesection or phlebotomy, and we'll hear more about this in the coming weeks, but it was quite common. On the community level, it was also possible to try some form of prophylaxis. If plague was caused by bad airs, bad odors, well, it might be possible to try better smells. So many communities tried burning tobacco in the town square, and sometimes individual people would carry nosegays, so little clusters of flowers underneath their noses to prevent the bad odors from getting into their bodies and causing plague. And this is a scene from London in 1665 during a plague outbreak. You also might be familiar with this figure shown here. This is a plague doctor holding a burning taper, like a little mini torch that emitted good odors. Physicians wore this elaborate costume consisting of a waxed exterior so smells couldn't stick, and this beak apparatus was often filled with some sort of aromatic thing to, again, prevent the plague from getting into them. Furthermore, when communities thought that plagues were caused by conspiracies or undesirable people among them, the strategy was always to punish those people. This led to horrible pogroms against Jewish people in Basel, Aragon, and Flanders, among other places. In other towns, sex workers and the very poor were driven away or killed. In the case of the Spanish spies in Milan, they were tortured and put to death. None of these actions, of course, stopped the plague. And for those who believed that plague was caused by divine retribution, the answer was simple: repent. So here we see Solomon Eccles during the 1665 London plague outbreak. He was one of many, perhaps the most successful of many evangelists who preached repentance as a respite or a cure from the plague. We can also note the brazier on his head burning fragrant substances, again, to keep the plague away from him, which is perhaps something of an indictment of his faith. Finally, the last possible intervention, and the most lasting, as it turns out, was we see the first sort of proto-public health measures enacted. So we see the emergence of things like boards of health, quarantines, lazarettos or pest houses, plague hospitals. Now, these measures were enacted at different times throughout Europe and in different ways, but they all had similar principles. Cities empowered health magistrates, officials whose job it was to formulate and enforce anti-plague policies. So, for instance, compulsory burial of people who had died of plague in plague pits, burning the possessions of people who had plague, disallowing travel in and out of cities, forbidding doctors from leaving cities so that there would be enough doctors to take care of the sick. In some cases, plague magistrates would control the food supply. They would close brothels and poorhouses. And the big point is that this was the first glimmer of the idea of treating the health of a population through a fusion of public health policy and statecraft, rather than leaving matters of sickness and disease strictly to individuals. These plague magistrates were also empowered to stop travelers from entering cities until they had undergone a period of isolation. This practice began in Dubrovnik in Croatia in 1377, when travelers who wished to enter the city would be forced to wait for 30 days on islands in the harbor. In the wake of the plague, the city-state of Venice began to use a series of fortified islands in their harbor to confine passengers and cargo. These fortresses earned the names lazarettos after St. Lazarus, the patron saint of the sick and diseased. Venetian authorities extended the waiting period to 40 days, giving the practice its current name, quarantine. During these 40 days, passengers disembarked from their ships and had to air out all the items and cargo on their boat to get rid of the bad vapors and to see who would come down with the disease. These state authorities were finally, in various forms and in various ways, empowered to confine disease sufferers or those they thought to be suffering. We see the creation of pest houses or plague hospitals, not places where plague sufferers would go to get better, but where they go to be isolated from society. Different governments had different styles of quarantine. England had less enthusiasm for public pest houses than on the continent. In London, during the 1665 plague outbreak, plague sufferers were simply locked in their houses, but the effect was similar. All of these practices, it should be noted, required significant administration and state authority, the power that is to organize, control, restrict, and sometimes to feed, care for, and confine people who did not want to be confined, controlled, or restricted. This practice, that is, required a strong state. Of all the measures deployed against plague between 1300 and 1800, it was these last that seemed, and seem in retrospect, the most effective. Through the imposition of quarantines, many medical historians argue, human beings first gained a measure of control over pandemic illness. Quarantine, the first true state-run public health measure, was a success.